Welcome to Anthropish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Sarah Dugnan. There's a lot happening in the world right now, and it can be dizzying to keep up with. It's not something that I want to dismiss, but I do think that reframing how we look at the so-called status quo of our food systems amidst all of this politic and tariff and threats to food sovereignty is something that needs to be done from multiple angles in order to make more impactful changes. And when it comes to industrial food systems, these tend to take a very monocropped and unilinear approach to supplying food systems, particularly with the global north. But what happens when we look at more diverse crops? My guest today is Shreema Mehta, who is here to talk about just that. Based out of Brooklyn, Shreema makes foods and writes about the traditional climate-smart crops that get overlooked by the industrial food system. She spent her entire adult life interested in sustainable food systems and started her food business, Climate Cookery, by selling tamarind hot sauce. Since then, she's expanded Climate Cookery to a beautiful newsletter and powerful writing that explores climate-friendly crops. On today's show, she explores climate-smart crops, the idea of underused crops from a UN perspective, and how to engage with more biodiversity at a local level, as well as some of the many considerations that she brings into her writing through Climate Cookery. Here's my conversation with Shreema. Welcome to the show, Shreema. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you, Sarah?
Great. I'm so excited to have you. So we connected over Substack, and I feel like this extra set of energy being able to connect with other Substack writers on the podcast this season, it's like a new treat for me to have you here.
It's so nice being on Substack. I feel like I've connected with a bunch of new people, and it's a great community.
Yeah, especially for writers that live in isolation sometimes. So for those that don't know who you are, do you mind providing a bit of background on who you are, where you're coming in from, and a snapshot of the type of work that you do?
Yes, sure. So yes, I'm Shreema. I am based in Brooklyn, in New York, and I write a newsletter called Climate Cookery, where I make recipes and write about climate smart, underutilized is the term, crops that are overlooked by the industrial food system, and trying to find delicious foods, joyful, trying to bring joy into this topic that can be kind of sad and dark sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's important that you add that because I think that's very much reflected in what I've read of your work. And as you said, I think quite often, especially for younger people kind of trying to grapple with the idea of climate change, it can be such a overwhelming topic. So bringing some joy and some infusions of everyday life to ground that practice, I think is so important.
Exactly. Agreed.
So do you mind sharing a little bit about the ethos for Climate Cookery? I know there's been different iterations of Climate Cookery for you through the years. So what are some of those key elements that you think are essential in order to bring that to the public?
Yeah, so I think the main thing is, right, so repeating, just trying to create agency, trying to find what can I personally do as an eater, as someone who lives in a city, right? But not that, or anywhere, but I'm not necessarily growing food, but what can I do as someone who's concerned to change the food system. So that's the ethos. That's where what drew me to create Climate Cookery is to help introduce a lot of these foods that have disappeared over the years due to industrialization, that have either been completely wiped out, or at least they're just less known. They're not commercial, and they're just not eaten as much as they can be. And trying to just show people all of these opportunities. So it's good for the environment, but they're also good for your health. They also create, new flavors and new textures and kind of new food experiences that you would not normally have. So yeah, I think that's kind of just diversity, bringing back traditional disappeared crops, bringing them back into the mainstream. So I started it as a food business. I was selling a tamarind hot sauce, because tamarind being an example of one of these crops, which I was actually surprised to learn that kind of the agriculture experts and international development experts consider to be underutilized, because I just feel I thought everyone just loved tamarind, but I guess it is maybe not. Yeah, I guess it is less known than like lemon or something like that, for example.
Right.
You know,
That makes me wonder, though, about, you know, even the idea of underutilized crops, you know, underutilized by who? Like, do you find that there's like a major voice kind of dictating, you know, that lemon is more utilized than tamarind?
absolutely. Yes, yes. I think it's exactly right. So it's this kind of, I think, globalization and globalization, kind of the domination of Western culture. It's a result of that, as basically, right, at the end of the day. Yeah, globalization it's brought a lot of benefits too, but I think this kind of really like focusing on really commercializing the food system, so to maximize profit above every other factor, has kind of led us to focus on very few foods. So, a statistic I like to say often is that around the world, and not just in Western countries, but all around the world, people derive half of their calories from rice, wheat, and corn. Just those
Wow.
three. So yeah, and then it's often kind of Western
Yeah.
taste preference often dominate like the foods, which I'm sure our listeners can imagine why.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And it makes me think too, you know, you spoke to like the idea of like globalization within the food system. And when you're looking at these big three, rice, wheat, and corn, you think of these big three, it's not just that, you know, you're just eating like a bowl of rice, but rice can also be put into so many of our more like processed foods as one of those like filling ingredients. And you know, I think about corn constantly and like how corn syrups and everything, or how corn just is used as like a stabilizer through so many of the
Mm,
foods that you would find. And in a globalized landscape, like to me, strikes me that that would be present across a lot of different communities.
yep. Yeah. I'm sure you probably read I think it was Michael Pollan who wrote about corn. And
Yeah.
he said something really interesting, like, if I can remember correctly, but if an alien species were to look at the United States, for example, they might be like, who's in charge here? Is it the humans or is it corn that's in charge? Based on how we've kind of just completely redesigned our system in this country around corn, and probably I'm guessing Canada too. It's similar, or
Yeah, definitely. Corn is a big one. Another one is like we make a lot of canola oil and
Mhm.
oat. Like those are the big ones here that we export. A lot of seed oils as well in the prairies, which is it's one of those interesting things where you don't really realize like how prominent it is in Canada as an export, because having lived in the prairies, like I see how much space that takes up. But then in southern Ontario, you have no idea like what the oat fields look like or what the corn fields look like to the same extent. So there's that like diffusion of responsibility in there too.
Yeah, I mean, and I can say, I mean, it's just because I've read about it. Because that's how I know. But yeah, it's not, I don't have like a knowledge of like the cornfield, but it'll be good to visit those areas sometime. But
Yeah,
yeah, but totally. But yeah, no, I think that's an important part of this, right? Like we're just being so out of touch with where our food comes from and all that, the commercialization.
hugely. So yeah, so I wanted to look at some of the ideas of underutilized crops that
Mhm.
you explore. How would you define or kind of situate underutilized crops? You kind of hinted at that, but what sorts of crops would you use as examples, and how would you explain it to someone that's not familiar?
Yeah, absolutely. So a classic example of an underutilized crop is millet, or even like amaranth, sorghum as a grain instead of rice and corn and wheat, So I think that's kind of the classic example. So I think like what makes them underutilized is they are way less popular. They also don't, they're eaten less. They also receive less government and commercial R&D support. And I guess those things are linked, right? The lack of government commercial support, the popularity of them. And I think like, raises a question of, well, why are they less popular? So I think for millet in particular, and probably a lot of crops, they are more difficult. They can be difficult to process. So that's kind of so I think what happened, I'm guessing what happened is, so I know corn it's very prolific. So then the government put a lot of attention to it. So I think, paying attention, I mean, it's logical. It makes logical sense to maybe invest in easier to process crops that were going, they're easier to grow and process and distribute and all that stuff. And then I think there's just like cultural reasons too of why they're less, why they're less popular. So crops like millet are often associated with poorer people, like people who they grow it for subsistence. They're not, you know, they're more maybe both, or it's not considered a crop that's associated with richer people. Actually, the example I was thinking about this morning in preparation for our chat is ramps, like, ramp season.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's like, I know, like on social media every year, there's these people who just go nuts for ramps. And, they're really delicate. They're kind of, my understanding is they're fragile. They are like a little bit finicky. There's like a finite supply. And so for that reason, they're seen as special over, like garlic, onions, leeks, all of these foods that are also really delicious, but because they're relatively easy to grow, and they're relatively prolific, relatively hardy, they're kind of seen as not special, I
Yeah.
think, I don't know, but it's these very qualities. I think they're hardy, they kind of grow, like you don't need to pay attention to them as much, and they'll still kind of grow anyway. And like these traits kind of that make them seem not special. And I feel like for me, I'm like, that's what makes them special and beautiful, that they do have these qualities. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. You paint such a really nuanced perspective of like all of the different factors that go into what makes a crop underutilized or overutilized. And it's, from listening to you, it feels like it's so hard to parse out like if there's like one defining moment or not.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that understanding even of like seasonality and
Mm-hmm.
specialness too is so fascinating because I think it's, particularly thinking about like cultural appetites. I loved what you said about the like government funding and policy
Mm-hmm.
as it relates to that because it's like how do you detangle that when it's such a commodified industrialized system. But I wanted to switch gears a little bit and think about some of the work that you do writing about these crops as climate smart crops because
Mm-hmm.
there's obviously so many challenges facing us in the future, but what sorts of advantages do these underutilized crops have in terms of like being climate smart? Are some of them more climate friendly or climate hardier than
Mm-hmm.
others?
Yeah, I think so. When I say climate smart, I think they are they have a lower environmental footprint, I think is kind of the maybe more specific way to say it. So a lot of these crops, they don't need as many fertilizers, or they might not need fertilizers at all. So um thinking about an example, like, a lot of the like amaranth, which kind of grows as like a weed, it's growing in my community garden, so yeah, and you don't need fertilizers because it just kind of grows a lot prolifically on its own. Or they don't need as much water. They can tolerate drought. So millet is a very, classic, well known in those circles example of a lot of countries are trying to grow millet to address kind of water scarcity issues. So I think those are kind of the primary, like not requiring a lot of inputs, not requiring a lot of fertilizer, which is a huge greenhouse gas emitter, not requiring a lot of water, which water short climate change is already
Yeah.
exacerbating water.
Yes.
Water issues, yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah, a lot of cover, right? So cover crops, a lot of these crops are often cover crops, so that prevents soil erosion and protects the soil and protects the nutrients in the soil so that you don't need as many fertilizers and healthier crops as well. So yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. That makes me think too. I worked out with a First Nation out here in Ontario where we were like building community gardens a few years back. And the strategy of building those gardens was very much what you're talking about with the cover gardens
Mm-hmm.
for maize, beans, and squash
Mm-hmm.
coexisting in a way that like also helps the soil but they grow well together and it just feels like it's almost in stark contrast to like the monocrop
Yes.
industrial complex too, right? Like there's so many, even just, what you're saying with fertilizer use and stuff like that. There's so many kind of middlemen dependent on a very monotone situation. So I'm curious what your perspective is on that as well.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's the thing of right. I think like that whole three sisters, the beans, corn, and squash. So that's the whole thing, is bringing back some of these traditional. I think we already have a lot of the answers, and it's like kind of bringing it back rather than trying to create new solutions wholesale, which will then create their own set of problems. But yeah. So I think that's why in my tagline I'll say like traditional climate smart crops, because it is a lot of these bringing back these solutions. And then so definitely the whole thing about underutilized crops is like the goals, like expanding agriculture biodiversity, right? So bringing back new crops and expanding the number and the types and variety of crops that you grow and that you eat as well. Yeah.
Mm.
Like
Yeah,
yeah.
I think it's interesting. Well, I think it's incredibly important to focus on that traditional piece that you speak to as
Mhm.
well. And I'm curious, like in the Brooklyn context, like I've not been, so I'm not as familiar with that region. But are there initiatives or community efforts going on there to kind of diversify crops
Mhm.
throughout that landscape?
It's I think the short answer is no, just because it is a really urbanized, it's New York City. It's definitely very much urbanized environment. But like in the US overall, I'm sure like there's the regenerative agriculture movement is really big. So there's that. I think but speaking to New York City specifically, I do think there is a huge appetite for this story that I'm sharing. Like, I think people really do want to, like, not be a part of the problem. People really are, they want to be a part of the solution. They're maybe not sure exactly how to do that, So I've had a really positive experience kind of selling my hot sauce and then sharing my story, because I think there's from the so I think well I guess I bring that up to say, like, from the perspective of the eater, the eater. I think there's change or a desire to change, but it's complicated, and that's a whole conversation, right? It's like you want
Yeah.
change, but how much are you actually willing to sacrifice? But I mean,
Yeah. And I think that's also, well, I'd like to get your take on it too, but through your writing and climate cookery, like what you see as your responsibility that you bring to your writing and to
yeah.
your recipe crafting, how do you, or like what crops do you choose to feature?
Mhm.
Can you kind of speak to the politics of like what you bring to your newsletter?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something I really like struggle with. So yeah, sometimes I'm like, yeah, like, would it make sense for me to talk about like an exotic, quote unquote, far away fruit, like a Java plum, as an example of, like, would it make sense for me to highlight a fruit like that, which you would need to travel long distances to bring to here. But I think I just so there are a lot of examples of underutilized foods. So like grains, I've written about different types of grains as one. I think I just kind of the way I do it is like I'll think of ideas and then I'll just think about the climate perspective on it. So I think my next newsletter, I'm gonna write about pasta. My friend got me a pasta
Nice.
roller, so I'm eating like homemade pasta, which is very exciting. And thinking about like buckwheat. Well, how can I, make buckwheat pasta? That kind of that does diversify what you're eating, the kind of grains that you have. So I guess I'm probably not giving like a very clear answer, because it's something that I think of. Yeah, I also kind of struggle with that. I'm not sure. Is this kind of, is this an ethically fraught food to highlight?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge, and I think especially like your landscape being in New York,
Mhm.
there's so many different like unique foods more readily available than like in a much more rural context too, right? So it's like how do you navigate the balances of what food is there
Yeah.
and make sense of it and tell the stories? And like I think there's one essay in particular I really loved where you were looking at like okra, and
Mhm.
that's something that is very common in grocery stores here, but then being able to place it in time with Black heritages as well, and like
Yeah.
that storytelling component, I think kind of allows you to navigate that complexity as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And I think it is kind of, I just, when I'm at a grocery store, I just try to pay attention to what is being sold. And like, so, at my local grocery store, there's cactus nopales that's being sold. So I got I'm like, oh, that would be actually something that's really good. That would be good to write about. It is, but it is kind of, yeah, I'd be curious about your thoughts on it too, because the thing about like local versus food that's from far away is, I do think farmers from, countries like India, which is, I'm Indian of heritage, they should also be able to benefit from like this globalized economy that I've so clearly benefited from. So I feel like I don't want to be like, no, I just local, for that
Yeah.
reason. So I don't know. Would you have thoughts on that?
That's a good question. I think I've been really digging into the idea of local food and kind of unpacking it this season in particular with in conversation because, sometimes like I've had conversations with people where local food just isn't affordable. Like it's
Yeah.
like CSA boxes can be pretty hefty, like outside of Toronto,
Yeah.
hefty price tags.
Yeah.
And sometimes you also have like, droughts or forest fires or things affecting local
Yeah.
food chains in much more visible ways. And I think, you kind of speak to that too, where you're looking at different crops from India and the opportunities for those farmers, particularly given like the political struggles that those farmers have been through in the
Yeah.
last 5-10 years, right? I think it's like, how do you walk the line between exploring those in compassionate ways and then not going so far as to like the quinoa boom of the twins where it was like exploitive of farmers. But I think it's like it's how you speak to it too, right? Like that was all kind of the tradition and knowledge was washed away and it was superfoods and
Yeah.
not like rooted in
Right.
heritage.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And actually that reminds me of, I think that reminds me back to the agricultural diversity point, which is like, it's in the same way that your investment portfolio, you diversify your investment portfolio. I think it's like
Yeah.
the quinoa boom. There was like all of a sudden all this attention on just quinoa, like which created all these problems. So I think, yeah, that's why it's like, just for me. Yeah, that's why I think agricultural diversity is very important. With that kind of mindful like thinking that you were talking about as well. Yeah.
That's a great point. Yeah, I always think back to I took this really cool class in undergrad where it was like the collapse of complex societies and one of the key tells across so many was that they started to like monocrop or they started to just go down one sort of feedback pathway and as you said like you explore a variety of different crops and their stories through your Climate Cookery newsletter and I think just bringing those approaches and the ripple effect that sort of diversity in writing can bring to diversity of food is super important too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. Yeah.
So what are, for people who are engaging with this idea, what are some steps that you'd recommend people taking if they want to learn more about crop biodiversity on a more individual level?
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of great resources out there. I think I would say the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, they have a lot of great resources on this topic. They have a lot of like reports that they come out with. That's been a lot of where I've gotten my information. Yeah, I remember reading this report like Future Smart Foods, which I think we mentioned in a previous email. So a lot of those like the FAO reports, they have a lot of information. There's also neglected and underutilized species database, which is from another one of these, types of international organizations. That's another good resource. I'm trying to think of like books I've read I know there's books on my reading list that I have not yet gotten to, but yeah, it's something that like people like think like I feel like people are starting to talk about now, but it seems like there isn't that much talking. There's not that much, but I could be wrong. I could just not have missed. I could have just missed it, but it seems like there isn't that much now. People are starting to talk about like agricultural diversity.
Yeah, I think as you said, I think it's there's like complexities in who's talking about it and how they're talking about it too. And I really love your approach to it because it becomes accessible to someone who's in their kitchen trying to, make sense of this really big, complicated, sometimes dark world, right?
Yep. Yep. Yes. Yeah, exactly. That's my whole goal with Climate Cookery. So appreciate it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Shreema, thank you so much for chatting. Do you mind sharing where folks can find you online if they'd want to follow along and learn more about Climate Cookery?
I'd love to, yes. So I'm at Climate Cookery on Instagram. And then my newsletter, you can also find at climatecookery.com, and you can subscribe there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Shreema. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
That was Shreema Mehta. I've included her newsletter and her social media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at our website at anthodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthodish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please rate us on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out. For more Anthodish, you can sign up for my newsletter at sarahduignan.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at Anthodish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you're thinking about food. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.